Hey guys, welcome back to Gaming for the Grade, where I play games and you hopefully learn something of use. If you're new here, basically that's all we do is play games and chat about GCSE English stuff. If you're old here, well, thanks for liking, subscribing, and coming back for some more. We really appreciate your support and your engagement. Before I get into today's video, I've been asked to give a little shout out to my A1s from day one. You know who you are. And hopefully y'all are learning something. Anyways, today we are talking about A Christmas Carol. And particularly, we're going to be looking at the Poor Laws and how they influenced and shaped Dickens' text. Alright, so the Poor Laws had been in place in Britain since about the 1600s. In 1834, however, the Poor Laws changed, and they changed for a couple of reasons. One of them being that workers were actually trying to unionize. They were trying to kind of advocate for themselves and for some change, and obviously the government and employers, the wealthy in society weren't really big fans of that plan. So the Poor Law gets amended in a reflection of the government's intention to make being in a workhouse worse than the experiences as the poorest laborers outside of the workhouse. So any job that was being performed inside of a workhouse was intentionally meant to be more challenging and more demeaning than anything you could do outside of the workhouse. The idea being that the fewer people who are eligible for the workhouse, the better. And we can see that when Scrooge mentions the treadmill in the beginning of the novella to the charityman. The treadmill, of course, being a very heavy wheel that people in the workhouses literally just had to push around and around and around for 10 hours, 12 hours in a day to grind grain. Where are you? Up there. Okay. Never mind. So yeah, that's essentially kind of the things that were going on around Dickens at the time. Oh, hello. Now let's talk about the workhouses a bit more themselves, because we've talked about how demeaning the work was and how it was intentionally meant to be so. You know, the idea was to make them as unattractive as possible to incentivize the poor to work on their own and not rely on government assistance. This would obviously reduce the cost to the government and the state, and kind of fit in with people's ideas at the time about the poor being undeserving of aid and support. So that idea of reducing spending on able-bodied people and the idea that the poor are undeserving of aid and support. You can kind of get the sense that 1834 isn't the most generous, kind, or even Christian time, really. It's just not very Christianly behavior, having this attitude towards your fellow man as being undeserving of your aid and support and blaming them for their own for their misfortune. Because if we think about Tiny Tim, for example, it is not his fault that he is sick and poor. Okay. It's not his fault he's sick and poor. And actually, the whole Cratchit family, they work. And yet despite working, they are not able to provide meaningfully for their whole family. And so there comes a degree in which you can't blame them for their situation. They are working poor and they're still unable to make ends meet. So it's definitely a flawed idea in 1834 that the poor are to blame for their own suffering. And I think reading the text, you can see that, actually the person who's to blame for Bob Cratchit's suffering is Scrooge for not being a caring, considerate, or Christian boss. And something else to consider about the workhouses, and this obviously goes hand in hand with the ideas of the period, is that admitting that you need a workhouse was a sign of a failing on that person's part. It would bring significant shame, and it would be a sign of a lack of morality, a lack of ability to survive in society and provide for yourself. And people would certainly look down on you for that. So when the charity men say that many would rather die than go to the workhouses, they're not just talking about the horrific conditions. They're talking about the shame and the degradation that comes with having to turn to that aid and support. What is that sound? All quiet. So that kind of gives you an idea of the point of the poor laws and the intentions behind, and kind of how things were in 1834 before Dickens writes the novella. Oh, hello. I'll come back this way. Oh, rats. Well, I'd say we're done there, but I've got a couple other things to talk about. So let's go again. You win some, you lose some. You can't win them all. And the next thing that I was going to talk about was our favorite person, Thomas Malthus of Malthusian theory. Now, obviously, you've probably talked about him in your English lessons, and his theory about how population would increase at a rate faster than food production. Now, something else to consider about Malthus is the fact that he was a big advocate for the poor laws. And obviously you can tell from the text and the way that he has Scrooge kind of act as a mouthpiece for Malthus, and that Dickens and Malthus really did not get along at all. That they were clearly on very different sides of this argument. And Malthus certainly carried the attitude that people who could not sustain themselves didn't deserve to live. They didn't have the right to live. And so he was actually a big advocate of the workhouses because he felt that that would be another way to kind of thin out the herd and separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. If you don't know what that means, it means separating what's good from the bad, basically. And so him being an advocate of the poor laws, you can again see that juxtaposition between him and Dickens. Obviously, we look at Malthus and that idea of the poor starving off and dying from Scrooge's perspective, and how the charity men kind of challenge that perception, and also express how unhelpful the workhouses are to the poor. But I also want to look at ignorance and want. And if you can't remember who ignorance and want are, they are the children who come out from under the Ghost of Christmas Present's robes, meager, wolfish, scowling, all of those really violent descriptions, really animalistic descriptions there. Why don't I have a shotgun? Oh, there we go. So yeah, we see that kind of animal imagery. Oh yeah, it's a healing pond. Nice. And when we talk about ignorance and want, typically we talk about the wealthy in society being ignorant and the poor being in want. But it might not be quite so simple. Actually, I was reading some sources online where they were exploring ignorance and want, and the link for the video will be in the description if you want to have a read, and some links to some other bits and pieces as well. Come here, you. But they suggested that perhaps ignorance and want aren't the two sides of society, the wealthy and the poor. What if actually Dickens might be suggesting to us that as long as people are ignorant, that includes the poor, right? The poor who lack an education, lack the proper support from government and state to improve their lives. What if he's saying that without that, they will always be in want, that there's no way to get rid of poverty unless we invest in improving the knowledge and understanding of our poor. And I think that's quite an interesting idea. Ooh, stressful. Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting idea, actually. Because it very much so places the onus back on the state and on the government to realize that they are responsible for the poor being in the state that they are, not the other way around, you know? Things are very much so set up to perpetuate oppression. And until steps are taken to improve things for the poor, to give them knowledge, to give them training for qualification, to help them better their lot in life, then there's never going to be any hope of them rising above their impoverished state, of raising their situation. The only way in which that can happen is through the generosity of others. And I mean, we see that in A Christmas Carol, where at the end, Scrooge decides he's going to raise Bob's salary and he's going to sit down and work out a plan for him, and he becomes a second father to Tiny Tim. And we can see there the direct effect that generosity has on Bob and his family, that their entire lives turn around for the better due to the generosity that they are given from Scrooge. And that's not Dickens asking for the wealthy to, give up their wealth and their status and their businesses and things. He's not really arguing for like communism or socialism or anything like that, especially considering obviously the novella predates those concepts. But he is very much so arguing for that Christian idea of caring for your fellow man, loving your neighbor. And I think that's where the novella gets so much traction, because he's not faulting anybody for what they have or what they are, but he's showing a better way forward, a better way to be, in a way that is more generous and caring to your fellow man. Where is he? Got him. Those are kind of the key points that I wanted to cover today. God, I love a slab slice. Favorite thing. Do I want that or do I want that? I'll take those. So I guess now we just play until I die and hope for the best. Something interesting though that I did come across when I was doing some wider reading to prepare for today's video is that workhouses were commonly called bastilles. Now, if you know anything about history, you know that the Bastille is a very famous prison from the French Revolution, which was destroyed. It's a symbol of tyranny. And so the fact that people were calling workhouses bastilles can speak to, the tyranny that they perceived the workhouses as kind of having. But equally, it could speak more positively to people's hopes that, or dreams of tearing down the workhouses, of getting rid of them, just like the French had done with the Bastille. Obviously not a very nice nickname to give, but does again attest to the fact that workhouses were seen as prisons, and they were very akin to prison. Where'd you go? Oh, that's the end of us. Anyways, hope you liked today's video. If you did, like and subscribe. We'll be back again talking about something else GCSE related. In the meantime, make sure you're revising, make sure you're mind mapping, and we'll see you again.